Do you think every family has a villain, or is it more complicated?
Sunday dinners in my family have always felt less like a chance to be together and more like a stage where everyone takes turns reminding me that I never quite measured up. So when Mark leaned back in his chair that night, smirked in front of my parents, and called me the family failure, I felt the familiar punch of humiliation, the kind that doesn't sting for just a moment but sits heavy in your chest, forcing you to stay quiet because you know if you open your mouth, every word will be dismissed before it's even finished. He said it casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like it was just a joke at my expense, and everyone laughed, even my mother, who quickly tried to cover it with a half-hearted, "Oh, don't be so mean." But the damage was already done because the room carried that silent agreement that I was indeed the one who hadn't done enough, hadn't become enough, hadn't lived up to whatever imaginary standard they always measured me against. I wanted to argue, to throw something back in his face, but what I've learned over the years is that arguing in that house only makes things worse because once you show them you're hurt, they'll keep pressing on the same bruise just to watch you flinch. So I kept eating, chewing slowly, pretending his words didn't slice me open the way they always did. But inside, I was done. Done with the role they had written for me, done with being the punchline, and done with Mark thinking he could treat me like nothing because he believed the family would always side with him. I smiled, I let it pass, and I acted as if it didn't matter. And that was the moment he made the biggest mistake of his life, because while he thought he was cementing his position above me, I was already holding something that could pull the floor out from under him. What none of them at that table knew, not my mother, not my father, and certainly not Mark, was that I had been working on something quietly for months. Something I never mentioned because I had learned the hard way that sharing anything with my family only turned into another excuse for them to criticize me. I had signed papers, sent emails, scheduled meetings, and lined up the kind of deal that people like my brother dream of being included in, but I had done it without fanfare, without asking for anyone's approval, and most importantly, without saying a single word to Mark. He thought my silence meant defeat, but the truth was that silence had become my weapon, and by the time he realized it, it would already be too late. I sat through the rest of that dinner listening to him brag about his job, about the connections he had, about how his boss really valued his insight. And I could feel my parents hanging on every word as though he were some great success story that had graced our bloodline. They nodded, they smiled, and they ignored me as if I wasn't even in the room, as though I were a shadow sitting in the corner rather than their daughter at the table. I didn't fight for attention because I didn't need it. In that moment, I knew something they didn't, and that knowledge burned like a secret flame that kept me steady while they laughed at me. The truth was, Mark's job, the one he always lorded over me, the one he used as proof that he had made it while I was still supposedly scrambling, was not nearly as untouchable as he believed. The company that had taken him in, where he strutted around like he was indispensable, was already in talks that would change everything, and I had a hand in that very change. While he mocked me for not keeping up, I had been building something bigger than him, bigger than their shallow praise, something that would turn the tables so completely that when the moment came, none of them would be able to laugh at me again. That night, when I left the dinner and drove home, I didn't cry the way I used to, and I didn't replay his words in my head like a punishment. I just let them sit there, meaningless, because tomorrow I would be standing somewhere else entirely, not at that table, not in that house, but in his world, in his workplace, holding the kind of document that decides careers. And when I placed it where it needed to go, there would be nothing he could say, no smirk, no insult, no smug grin that would save him. Mark thought Sunday dinner was about proving that he was the winner and I was the failure. What he didn't know was that Sunday was the last time he would ever get away with saying it. Because Monday was coming, and with it, the contract that would rip the ground out from beneath him. And when security took him by the arm and walked him out, I would be standing there, silent as ever, watching him realize the truth, that the so-called failure had just written the final chapter of his success story. I grew up learning that in our house praise always arrived wearing Mark's name tag, while my efforts came with a polite shrug and a quick change of subject. Which sounds petty when you say it out loud, but anyone who has lived it understands how a pattern like that settles into your bones until you start measuring your words, your steps, and even your hopes against a scoreboard you never agreed to play on. So by the time we were adults, he had become the official success, and I had become the optional conversation filler who should smile, clear the plates, and pretend it never stung. It started small with teachers telling my parents that Mark was promising while I was creative. And it kept building with those family gatherings where my wins were treated like temporary hobbies while his small promotions were paraded as proof that he was cut from a better cloth. And I learned something I doubt they intended to teach me, which is that silence can be a fortress if you stop using it as a hiding place and start using it as a workspace where you can build in peace without everyone's hands grabbing the tools out of your fingers. Mark liked to pretend his job was a private jet fueled by talent, but the truth is he got his first break because Dad's old friend sat on a board and made a call. And once you are carried into a building on someone else's shoulders, it becomes very easy to believe the elevator rises because of your own genius. So, he developed that smooth habit of dismissing anyone who did not orbit around him, which in his mind included me, and if I am being honest, I let him believe that because it kept him loud and predictable while I quietly collected the kind of relationships that do not post selfies and do not gossip at holidays, but do move money and signatures when the timing is right. While he was chasing applause, I was learning the schedules of attorneys who actually read every page, the moods of operations people who hate being surprised, and the private skepticism of executives who can admire a confident face at a networking event yet still search for a spine under the smile, and over time those people started replying to me because I never wasted their attention, never asked for favors I could not repay, and never panicked when something looked messy but fixable. And that is how you end up with your name on paperwork that does not need to be announced at dinner to be real. The company where Mark loved to boast about his impact had a weakness that was not dramatic but very real, a tangle between outdated contracts and an expansion plan that kept missing its targets by just enough to make investors twitch. And when my team stepped in to solve a separate problem that intersected with theirs, I did not crow about it. I just listened, mapped the moving parts, and realized that there was an elegant way to combine what we were offering with what their board wanted, which was stability without the smell of panic, and the shape of that solution inevitably touched Mark's division, because it was heavy on headcount and light on verifiable results. I did not design anything to hurt him, I designed something that worked, but once you map the logic and you see where the weight has to be cut in order to keep the whole thing standing, you either pretend not to notice and let the structure crush the floor later, or you call it like it is and make the changes before the cracks turn into a collapse, and I chose the adult option. Which meant that the same smug voice that laughed at me over roast and potatoes was now documented, by his own reports, as a cost center wrapped in jargon. When I replayed his Sunday smirk in my head that night, it did not make me cry the way it used to, it sharpened my focus, because I realized that what had felt like a lifetime of being underestimated had become the perfect cover for moving freely. And I could finally stop second-guessing the clean decision that had been waiting for a push, so I opened my laptop, pulled up the addendum our council had drafted to finalize the integration timetable, and rechecked the clause that shifted Mark's unit into the non-retained list with a generous transition package that would sound dignified in a memo while clearing the path for the actual performers to keep the lights on. People will say that is cruel, but cruelty would have been letting the company stumble while I spared one fragile ego, and anyway the choice was not mine alone because the math made the case and the board had already nodded along. All they needed was the signed confirmation that would land in their inbox before the morning call, so I took a breath, verified every attachment, and pressed send on the secure signature packet addressed to their general counsel and to the chief executive with the timestamp that locked the schedule, and in that long quiet moment after the whoosh I felt the old narrative slide off my shoulders like a coat that never fit me in the first place. By the time the confirmation email arrived with its dry little line about receipt and routing, I knew there was nothing left to argue over at any table in that house, because the decision was on paper and the clock was already moving. And while he slept thinking he had humiliated me into silence, my silence had stamped the one letter that would decide the rest of his week. So I closed the laptop, poured a glass of water, and allowed myself one small, steady thought that tasted like justice. Without gloating, which was that by choosing to treat me like the family failure, he had volunteered to discover what I become when I stop asking for a fair fight and simply follow the plan to the end. By the time the final countersignature posted and the notification trail reached every person who needed to see it, I had already stopped replaying his laugh and started rehearsing the practical choreography that would keep this from turning into a loud family spat disguised as business. Because I wanted a process so clean that even the people who love to pick at motives would have nothing to hold. So I called our counsel to verify sequencing, confirmed custody of the originals, asked for a plain language summary I could hand to anyone who mattered, and set reminders that would keep my tone steady and my answers short when the real moment arrived. What steadied me most was the unglamorous truth that the deal stood on its own 2 feet, since the numbers supported the timetable and the integration solved problems that had been politely ignored for far too long. And when I woke before dawn and read replies from the lead attorney, the finance partner, and the executive sponsor who had backed me when this was only a careful sketch, I felt something expand that had been shrinking for years. Not triumph exactly, but a quiet relief that I no longer needed anyone at that table to recognize what I had built in order for it to be real. You cannot imagine how often I was told to be realistic, which was their warm way of saying lower your expectations and accept your assigned seat, and you cannot imagine how many lectures I absorbed about not burning bridges, which somehow never applied to the relatives who set them on fire and then acted shocked by the smoke. And once I finally understood that their advice was about keeping me small rather than keeping me safe, everything changed, because meetings grew shorter, decisions moved faster, and the results landed without fanfare in places where fanfare is not the currency. The contract itself was not flashy, which is exactly why it had teeth, because it did not hide behind jargon or promise miracles. It tied milestones to deliverables, tied compensation to performance, and tied headcount to verified outcomes. And the board liked it because it offered stability without a panic headline, while operations liked it because it replaced a maze of duplicated efforts with a map anyone could read. And if that map routed his division into a transition pool, the reasoning lived in their own reports, not in my history. I asked for one courtesy that no one argued with, which was a private pass with human resources to protect the people who quietly kept things running, because I had no interest in collateral damage wearing the mask of justice. And I carried a short list of names gathered from assistants and coordinators who actually know where systems creak and where projects get rescued, and those names were folded into the retention plan without fuss, which let me look at myself without flinching when the larger cut arrived. There was a moment when I wondered if I should warn him, if I should send a measured note that might soften the landing or let him choose his exit, yet the thought dissolved as quickly as it surfaced. Not because I wanted to watch him fall, but because the point of leaving that old script was learning to respect the line between personal history and professional duty, so I decided my only job was to show up on time, deliver what I was responsible for, and step out of the way while the structure did what it was designed to do. I booked a visitor slot through the official portal because I was not going to turn Monday into theater, saved the confirmation, printed the clean set, and rehearsed answers that were plain and boring. Since boring is the language of authority when people expect drama, and somewhere between folding the envelope and placing it by the door I noticed that my hands were steady, which told me more about readiness than any pep talk ever has and reminded me that I had finally stopped asking for a fair chance and started taking the chance available. Mid-morning brought a small twist that would have rattled the earlier version of me, an accelerated timetable requested by their counsel to lock the transition date before an internal review could muddy the water. And instead of spiraling, I thanked them for the update, moved my calendar forward, and carried the envelope to the car, repeating to myself that the only difference between a clean ending and a messy spectacle is whether people keep their heads and follow the plan, which I intended to do down to the smallest step. If you want to know whether guilt crept in, I can say that what I felt was not guilt, but the ache of wasted years, the waste of letting other people narrate me into a corner when I had the tools to build the door the whole time. And maybe the slow burn had a purpose because it taught me patience, taught me to value the unremarkable habits that hold complicated moves together, and taught me that sometimes the sharpest revenge is just doing the job so well that no one can argue with the outcome, even if they despise the author. When I finally lifted the envelope and headed for the badge desk, I understood that there was nothing left to decide because the clock was already running and the signatures were already archived, and all that remained was to walk across an ordinary lobby, hand a stack of pages to a person whose nod would trigger a long chain, and wait for the calendar entry that reads like any other meeting while quietly meaning an ending, which is why I smiled at the guard, accepted the visitor pass, and stepped toward the elevator knowing that the next time he saw me would be the moment he learned that silence, when used properly, is not surrender but permission to strike. Monday did not feel like a victory lap or a vindictive mission so much as a necessary appointment that had been scheduled for months and finally arrived on time, which is why I parked in the visitor section, walked past the framed slogans that pretend accountability is a shared value, and introduced myself to the reception desk with the same neutral tone I use when I am about to press a button that cannot be unpressed. Then presented the clean set of documents that summarize the integration terms, the retention grid, and the transition list that had been agreed by council, finance, and operations, all of it written in that calm corporate dialect that turns big decisions into tidy sentences and leaves very little room for theatrics. A manager from legal came down first, a quiet woman whose emails had always landed with clarity and no glitter, and after a brief confirmation that I was the person who had managed the workstream on our side, she led me through badged doors to a conference room that looked like every conference room everywhere, and I set the envelope on the table, watched the general counsel join with a nod, and began walking through the sequence we had all rehearsed, resisting any urge to explain more than necessary because the smartest thing at moments like this is to let the paper do the talking while you keep your voice slow, your answers short, and your face uninteresting enough that no one mistakes you for the main event. It took less than a quarter hour for the signatures to replicate across their internal system, and while the council routed the notice to human resources and the chief of staff triggered the access changes that sit behind every polite separation, another manager dialed in Mark's director, a careful man who had already read the packet and knew what the grid meant for headcount, and when he asked whether the effective date remained as written I confirmed it, adding that the transition package was generous and the references would be neutral, which is the language of mercy in big companies, because it lets a person start over without the kind of scarlet letter that tanks their next interview before they enter the lobby. None of this felt cinematic until the door opened and Mark walked in with the bright confidence he always wears when he knows an audience is waiting. And, because he thought the meeting concerned a partnership expansion, he smiled at me with the same condescension he saves for holidays, asked where he should sit, and began a light monologue about how his team could accelerate adoption if we gave him discretion. And I let him talk for just long enough to make clear that he still believed the room belonged to him, then slid the summary across the table and watched the moment when his eyes met the paragraph that removed his unit from the new structure, a single paragraph that did not insult him, did not accuse him, and did not list his casual cruelty as a factor, yet still ended his role as cleanly as a door closing behind a person who thought the hallway was endless. He looked from the paper to me as if I had violated a family rule written in invisible ink, said my name like a warning, and tried to pivot into bargaining, then into charm, then into the vague threat people make when they still believe reputation can out documentation. But the council answered each point with the same steady cadence. The director kept his hands folded, and I spoke only when a factual detail needed a timestamp, which is how power sounds when it stops auditioning and simply enforces the agreement that everyone already accepted. Security arrived without hurry, two polite men who had clearly done this enough times to make it boring, and they asked for his badge and guided him toward the door while he turned back to me with that look that asks whether blood outweighs signatures, whether the old dynamic will swoop in and rescue him one more time, and I did not break eye contact or apologize or gloat. I just told him, in the same even voice he mocked last night, that the transition team would reach out by end of day, that I had asked for his benefits to be extended through the season, and that he would receive copies of the documents for his records because respect for the record is the only respect that matters when the noise dies down. He tried to summon outrage with my name on it and found instead a corridor with no audience, and by the time the elevator doors closed on his disbelief, I was already thanking the staff who had handled the logistics, confirming that the protected names on my retention list were safe, and replying to a message from an assistant who had been quietly holding her breath for months, a small kindness I could finally return. And when I walked back through the lobby, I felt that steadiness again, not the glee of a petty win, but the relief of a clean line where a messy story used to loop. In the car, my phone lit up with family texts that started as question marks and flipped into accusations once Mark reached the parking lot and rewrote the scene for them, and while the thread filled with familiar demands for explanations and apologies, a separate notification landed from a private number that mattered more than all the rest, a short request for a meeting that would drag the truth into a room my parents cannot control, and as I put the car in drive, I understood that the real performance was only now being cast, because tonight there would be a table, there would be an audience, and there would be a choice that would decide whether I walk away quietly or open a file I have kept closed for years and let the cards fall exactly where they belong. By the time my phone stopped vibrating with those frantic messages that began as puzzled pings and turned into accusations wearing my name like a crime, I had already decided that if there was going to be a conversation, it would not happen on a thread where people perform outrage for an easy audience, so I told them I was willing to meet once, in a neutral place, with everyone present and no side calls from the parking lot, and I chose a small office used by a mediator I trust because rooms like that shrink the theater and enlarge the facts, which turned out to be exactly what the day required. Since within a few minutes of sitting down my parents were pleading and Mark was rewriting history as if Sunday had been a misunderstanding and Monday had been a random storm, while I stayed quiet long enough for them to run out of steam and look at me with the expectation that I would eventually play my assigned part and fix what they had decided I had broken. I told them calmly that I had not broken anything, that I had completed a deal that stood on its own legs and carried logic across a finish line it deserved to reach, and that the outcome at Mark's office was not an act of personal sabotage disguised as business, but the natural consequence of a structure that had been wobbling under the weight of vanity for far too long. And when my father tried the old line about family loyalty, I told him that loyalty without accountability is just a leash for the quiet one, then slid a thin folder across the table with boring, stubborn pages that did not care about tone, a timeline showing when I first joined the workstream, a list of the headcount metrics that made his unit unsustainable, and a confirmation signed by their counsel that the transition package had been executed exactly as promised, which meant the person crying betrayal was leaving with months of pay, extended benefits, and a neutral reference, while the assistants he dismissed as furniture were protected in their roles. My mother asked why I had not warned them, and I said I had learned the hard way that every heads-up in this family becomes a round of sabotage dressed up as concern, and that if I had told them, I would have spent the night before the signing fielding lectures about optics and forgiveness until someone leaked enough gossip to make the board nervous. And when Mark sputtered that I had cost him his reputation, I reminded him that reputations do not vanish because a sister shows up with a contract. They vanish because results fail to materialize after too many loud promises, and if he wanted a different ending, he might have considered listening when people without title told him what was breaking on his watch. I had come prepared for the demand that always arrives after the outrage, the old choreography where they insist that I make this right by cleaning up the mess their favorite child created. And before they could choreograph it, I placed a second envelope on the table, lighter than the first and much more personal, containing a simple boundary agreement written in plain English that said I would not fund, guarantee, or co-sign anything for anyone at that table, that I would not attend events where I am the designated target dressed up as entertainment, and that I would not respond to group messages that turn disagreements into a spectator sport, And to make the terms real rather than symbolic, I had already called the bank that morning to remove my name from the emergency line of credit that kept their bills from turning into alarms. A practical step that returned responsibility to the person who had spent years announcing that he was the family's strongest back. They called me cold, and I said I was done being warm in a house that treats warmth like weakness, then added one final piece, because I wanted the ending to be clear and fair rather than dramatic and foggy. I had established a small education fund for the youngest cousins with a trustee who is not related to any of us and who will distribute help based on grades and need rather than charm or pressure, which means my support for the next generation will bypass the politics that poisoned ours, and that, I told them, is the only version of legacy I am willing to finance. There was a long, ragged silence in which I could feel them measuring whether shouting would bend me back into shape, and when no one found the angle they wanted, my father asked if I was happy now, as if happiness were the point, and I told him no. That what I was finished asking for a fair reading from people who preferred a good story, finished subsidizing a narrative that called me a failure while spending the money I earned, finished waiting for an apology that would never arrive because the myth required my humiliation to stay intact, and then I stood, gathered the signed receipt for the boundary notice the mediator slid across the desk, and told Mark that when he is ready to be a colleague rather than a prince, I will answer his call, but until then the only voice he will hear from me will arrive on letterhead. On the way out, my mother reached for my hand and asked whether I at least understood how hard this is for a parent. And I said I understood more than she thought, because I had been parenting myself for years in a family that loved the idea of me as long as I played the part they wrote, and that I still loved them enough to choose the version of the future that keeps me sane and keeps their lights on without my name on their switches, which is the kind of love that finally knows where to stop. And when she let go, I saw the small, dawning fear that had been hiding behind the outrage all day, the fear that I was not bluffing, and I smiled without sweetness, because kindness does not always sound like kindness. That night, when the group thread revived with fresh lines about betrayal and image and what neighbors might say, I did not answer, because the only reply that mattered had already arrived hours earlier when the bank confirmed the removal of my guarantee and the mediator filed the acknowledgement of my boundary letter. And I realized that the plan I had been accused of not having was complete from the first silent insult to the last silent signature, so I turned the phone face down, poured water, and let the quiet settle like a door finally closed, knowing that he would wake up tomorrow and, for the first time in his scripted life, see that the person he mocked as the family failure had written the one story he could not edit, which is the story where I win by refusing to keep performing, and where the lesson for anyone still listening is simple and permanent. Underestimate the quiet one if you want a comfortable laugh, but understand that when the bill comes due, it will arrive with her name at the top, her terms on the page, and your signature already on the line.